Great job, Bill.
Let's first start with the very good news. One of the slides that Bill was showing is actually outdated, and that's good news because the budget he was showing and all the things that needed to be done is actually 1 billion higher, which means that the timeline is getting more compressed. So we might be able to do the things we need to do earlier. That was the whole idea. Now, the next panel is about aligning the needs of space with the other needs of this nation. Lynne Dittmar is going to be moderator of that panel. Now, Lynne leads the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, an alliance of space industry, business, and advocacy groups working together to show the public how relevant deep space exploration is to their lives. As Boeing's manager of the International Space Station mission operations and of the spaceflight training, Lynne is well aware of the special consideration that human spaceflight must hold within the space exploration program. Lynne herself is deeply interested in the Mars generation, of which Astronaut Abby is a member, whom we saw before earlier today. As the Mars generation are those people that will witness and hopefully stimulate human missions to Mars. It is with great pleasure that I am going to listen how she's going to align the various needs of this nation. Especially for me, exploring is the greatest need of any nation. These are your...
Those are our things.
Yes.
Can we put them on our feet? Okay, thanks. Okay. Just in case you missed that. So, thank you for still being in your seats this late in the afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here and spend a little time talking to you. When Chris reached out and asked me if I was interested in doing this panel, I said, sure, but what's happening, because it's an election year, is that people are talking about two things, usually in policy panels. One of them has to do with the transition, which is moving from one administration to the next. We have a lot of crystal balls in play right now, especially inside the Beltway. And also the other thing that people talk about all the time, which is engagement. And I've done a lot of work, in particular on the latter, over the years. So what we wanted to do today was try to do something a little bit different than that. And what I did was I looked back at a lot of work that's done. I'm affiliated with the National Academies, and I did a lot of work that looked at the National Academies and what they've done. And they did a report that was actually the last transition that was called America's Future in Space, Aligning the Civil Space Program with National Needs. So if you just heard the title of this panel, you understand a little bit about where the inspiration for this came from, only we're going to tweak it and talk about the journey to Mars. So the entire programmatic approach to going to Mars. Before we do that, though, I want to take a minute to introduce the other panelists here who have been so kind to join me, beginning with Dr. Jan Davis, who is on my left. Jan is Vice President and Deputy General Manager of Jacobs Engineering and Science Services and Skills Augmentation Group, which provides engineering, scientific, and technical support for projects and programs at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. Previously, Jan was the Director of Safety and Mission Assurance at Marshall, leading up to the successful return to flight from the Space Shuttle program in 2005. She was also Director of the Flight Project Directorate at Marshall. She began her NASA career in 1979 as an aerospace engineer. She supported multiple programs, including the Hubble Space Telescope, the Chanda X-ray Observatory, and the Hubble Space Telescope servicing missions. She was selected as an astronaut in 1987. She spent more than 670 hours in space as a mission specialist over the course of her 3 shuttle flights. While in the astronaut corps, she also served as the mission development branch chief in payloads, robotics, and EVAs. She did her graduate work in mechanical engineering at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and also holds degrees from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Harvard University. She's a fellow and an honoree in more societies than we can count. Jan, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Ms. Madi Sengupta Madi is a program manager at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA, where she is responsible for managing AIAA's bid to host the 2019 International Astronautical Congress in Washington, D.C. A former space shuttle robotics instructor at the NASA Johnson Space Center, Madi was responsible for training space shuttle and space station crews for their robotics operations on board the station, and was the lead station robotics instructor for the shuttle flights STS-132, STS-135, in an International Space Station expedition mission. In 2011, at the end of the shuttle program, she left NASA to pursue a graduate degree in public policy, focusing on understanding the drivers of domestic and foreign policy and interdependencies between technical and policy worlds in order to apply this understanding to influence U.S. space policy. She worked as a policy analyst for the city of Houston, then moved to the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation, and more recently, AIAA. In her spare time, Madi also serves as the Vice President for Strategic Communications and Outreach for the American Astronautical Society. She holds a BS in Electrical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master's in Public Affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. So we have some great panelists here. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about how you would use the program. The program, the journey to Mars, the initiatives to go to Mars, the national interest in going to Mars. Basically, how do you use it to address national needs? And the national needs that were talked about in the 2009 report included things like weather monitoring and climate monitoring, advancing science, both activity and education, continuing to sort of promote U.S. interests abroad and exert geopolitical influence, economic impacts like job creation, stimulating interest in education. And typically what we do is we end up talking about these things as spin-offs, right? So we talk about one thing that we get told about a lot is the Apollo program and its effect on education. So you've all heard this, right? The Apollo program led to all kinds of people going into STEM fields. The Apollo program, of course, occurred at the same time as other national initiatives which were encouraging people to go into STEM fields, and was also at a time where there was a high amount of money, 4.5% of the GDP, actually going into creating that program. So we're in a different state now. That program was also a crash program. It doesn't get referred to it that way often, but that's what it was. It was the crash program, and the agenda was to beat the Russians to the moon. It wasn't really to do space exploration. So now we're talking about actually doing space exploration, and we're talking about doing it over a long period of time. Depending on whose set of goals you listen to, we're talking about moving out to space to stay, to settle, to develop resources out there, to create an economy out there, maybe all of the above, okay, maybe multiple destinations, but the horizon goal of Mars. So how do you use that to address some of these national needs? So I'm just going to start with Jan. We just toss a couple questions around and have a discussion. And then when we're finished with that, or when we think we're wrapping up on that, we're going to ask you for questions and comments. So you have an amazing career.
True.
I've known several astronauts, and they spend a lot of time often in front of classrooms.
Yeah.
And I know this is a particular interest of yours. So can you talk a little bit about what you've seen and what you think about this general question of how you could use such a program?
Well, education is a passion of mine, and so my favorite thing to do is to go and talk to classrooms, because I think that's our future, and we certainly need a pipeline for the future. As far as how programs like this affect people, you know, I can look at myself, and growing up in Huntsville, Alabama, and during the time we were going to the moon, testing the rockets in Huntsville, et cetera, the engines greatly influenced my career, my desire to become an engineer. So I know there's that impact as well. It wasn't well organized for me. I mean, they brought in a TV for the classroom, and we watched the launch, and we talked about it, but it really didn't drive, you know, the science and engineering discussion that I think we need to have. What we did on Space Shuttle, and one thing I did in the astronaut office was I was head of the education working group, and we put together some plans in conjunction with the national science teachers and the math teachers that fit within the curricula nationwide. So we put together these Liftoff to Learning videos. We had a teacher's guide. We had activities for the students. All this was run through the scientists, engineers at headquarters for a particular topic. So I think we had 12 or 13 of these videos still available online for teaching things like Newton's laws, you know, what microgravity is, what you can do with it, why you go to space. So there were a lot of organized efforts to use the space shuttle for education. And so it was organized, not around a program necessarily, but certainly around science and engineering was very effective. We've slipped behind in the world. If you look at the rankings of how well our students do in math, we fall greatly behind other developing countries and developed countries. And so we're 35th out of 64 countries in math and 27th in science out of those countries. So although more people are going into science and engineering, it's not as high a rate as countries like China, India, even Mexico, Germany have doubled their rates in recent years, while ours is pretty flat. So how can we use this great program of going to Mars to really stimulate education, stimulate the discussion, make it a part of the program, give NASA the resources, give Department of Education the resources where we can actually put together a plan, a curriculum that we can use in schools, K through 12 as well as higher education, to really stimulate not only the inspiration we keep talking about, inspiring the next generation, but also use it to educate them. We've heard today already how maybe school kids aren't that familiar with what we're doing in space or the plans to go to Mars. So let's talk about it. Let's make it a part of the curriculum. Let's teach them a lot of things, a lot of science, a lot of engineering technology we can utilize and plan for as part of those curricula, and the inspiration as well. It can be a whole new generation, a whole new way of having a national initiative to promote STEM careers in our country.
So I just want to go back to one thing you said. Toward the end, then you said sort of make it part of the curriculum. So
Right.
do you think about it as a thread that could go from K through, how do you think about it in terms of making it part of the curriculum?
I think you would have to work with these, not only the state education organizations, but also the national science math teachers organizations. They now have engineering academies and engineering curricula across the country. While it may not be a part of the curricula, it could be a resource or a tool to sort of teach those things. I know in Alabama we have a whole new effort to include engineering starting at kindergarten.
Really?
Engineering activities. So, going to Mars, we could use that thread to sort of teach those kinds of things. So,
That's cool, kindergarten. I used to advocate for statistics in 7th grade, but you're doing engineering in kindergarten.
yeah.
It's like, okay.
Yeah, in Alabama.
In Alabama, yeah. Okay, so Maddie, I'm going to sort of turn to you for a minute. So Jan sort of made reference to the international slippage, frankly. Relative to what the United States is doing in terms of people going in and how they're scoring, right, on tests, which is part of what you were getting at, is that our test scores are becoming lower over time relative to our international peers. You spent a lot of time doing international work, right? Because part of what you were involved with was putting together this bid for the International Astronautical Congress. What have you seen with regard to international entities and organizations and their interest in the journey to Mars or the journey into space? And how do you think the United States is reflected there?
Yeah, I think, and I'll pull a little bit from my experience at the FAA as well, where I was doing some policy work there, and there are so many countries now who are interested in getting into the space game. And it's anywhere from developing countries all the way to established nations who understand and appreciate the value that the R&D and the technology development bring to their countries and their economies. And so you have places like Kenya and other African nations who are looking at building up their space programs so that they can keep some of their intellectual resources in-house in their countries, because as Jan mentioned, a lot of folks are studying, coming here, and then either staying here or we're, I think, now seeing a trend back that a lot of folks go back to their countries. And it's because their governments are taking part in initiatives like building their own space capabilities. So I think there's definitely a lot of interest, and I think that we run the risk of being too complacent about that level of interest and what we have accomplished. And that's not to underplay what we have accomplished. I think we've done a tremendous amount, and we continue to do a tremendous amount. But along with incorporating that into that inspiration and that initiative and interest into the education system, I think it's important to recognize that it needs to continue on into the workforce as well.
So, okay, great, workforce. We're talking about education and talking about international relations. Workforce development, right, is a big thing. We keep talking about it over and over again in the country. It ends up being, it's an issue in every election. It's tied to job creation, right? So workforce development, whether it's in space or not, okay, but certainly in science, technology, engineering, I'd add the arts, okay, for STEAM, and as well as math. That workforce development is just critical to maintaining US competitiveness. So for either one of you, and I'll kibitz a little bit because I'm a huge small business promoter, having started 3 of them and advised I don't know how many. I'll sort of come back around to that. But for either one of you sort of thinking about workforce development, obviously if you have money coming through the pipeline to support a long-term program, you're going to need a workforce in order to be able to work on that. Where are we? I mean, where are we in terms of workforce development? How does that fit with education? Where are we internationally? You know, kind of where do you think we are?
Well, you do have to look at the budgets, and unfortunately, you know, some countries' budgets are increasing in the space industry at a much higher percentage than our own. But even in our own country, even though we've had steady growth and people who are getting STEM degrees, if you look internationally, you know, it's a much smaller percentage that we're graduating here. And most companies, the number's like 60% of the companies currently in our business cannot fill all the vacancies that we have. I know my company, Jacobs, we're having a lot of difficulty filling vacancies in those STEM fields. And so I think the workforce development is not just graduating people, but also inspiring them and getting them interested in space, getting them interested in the mission, giving them those tools that they need for material science, technology, you know, communications. There are a lot of things that we need that if we include those once again, in our education system and our workforce development, I think maybe we can make that pipeline a little bit bigger. But right now, we're kind of losing ground in the space industry, even though STEM careers are increasing. The number of people going into the space industry is decreasing. So I think we need to do more, and I think going to Mars would just be a great infusion of not only cash and money to inspire and to give grants or to, you know, help promote scholarships, things like that, that NASA is so good at, and these programs that NASA is so good at. But it would give them an inspiration and a way to really develop our workforce in these STEM fields.
Okay. Maddie, we talked earlier about engaging the next generation, and Artemis made reference to my interest in that, and you're interested in it, I know. I'm kind of throwing you a little bit of softball because I was going to have you talk about international, but I know it's a favorite topic of yours. And since Jan just talked about it, how could this program be used to engage young people? We talk a lot about engagement, and the answer is not social media. Okay.
So just a little bit of background on me. I grew up wanting to work for the space program, and I don't know where I caught that bug, but I just did. My family visited Johnson when I was 8, and I remember walking away going, this is it, this is what I want to do. But I think the thing that really got me from this is what I want to do, it's out there, and this is how I need to, or what I need to do to get there, was a program that Johnson Space Center runs, and it still runs today. It's called High School Aerospace Scholars. And they bring in, I think it runs over 6 to 8, maybe 10 weeks in the summer. You come in for a week. And the way ours worked, we were the second year, so it's evolved a lot more since then, and it's a lot more fancy. But we came in and we worked in groups of 3 to build a mission to Mars. So I was in the getting there group, there was a working there group, and there was a living there group. And the whole week we did tours and heard from folks across the center, but then the main thing that we worked on was these parts of this mission to Mars. And I think the coolest thing about that was, one, it got us thinking more application-based, and it was kind of taking all of this stuff we were learning in high school in physics and chemistry and biology and calculus, and kind of applying it to something that was tangible, and we could ask people questions who specialized in these fields, and they would be able to kind of explain to us And the other thing that it did for me was that it taught me about the co-op program, and that was how I knew how to get to JSC as an employee. And I think that's one of the things that NASA does really well, and going back to what we talked about earlier about getting like Department of Education involved, I think to align these types of programs like Journey to Mars to these national needs, I think it takes thinking much more broadly than the commercial space industry or civil space or even military space. We need to be thinking kind of largely and looking as a community outward at what the national needs are that maybe transcend space, which I think sometimes is really difficult for us to do, and myself included. I think we tend to kind of think spin-offs, and these are the cool things that the space program brings, and look at your cell phone, it's so cool. But there are more pressing needs, and kind of pulling into the international piece again. I studied foreign policy, and one of the reasons I did that was because the Apollo program was used as a foreign policy tool. It was not, I mean, one of the byproducts was technology development and R&D in the country, and it added to the economy, but it was purely a foreign policy tool to get ahead of the Russians. And to understand, one of the things I really wanted to understand was how that can be used to kind of intersect with the domestic policy needs that we do have, like workforce development and education. And so I think there's lots of facets of Journey to Mars where if you're looking at K through 12 education, you can kind of look at more outcome-focused things that you can show applications to. If you're looking at university, the main thing, I think there are some undergrads in here, I think maybe. Yep, see some hands. You care about jobs, so when you get out of school, you want to have a job. And I think being able to understand the needs of those constituencies and also be able to figure out what the national needs are and aligning all of those. There's lots of ways that those things can overlap, but I think that's kind of the key, and I think a lot of times we struggle to do that because we're really focused on destinations and vehicles and building up capabilities and things like that. So,
one more point I wanted to bring out about workforce development is our aging workforce. 70% of NASA's workforce is between 45 and 60. And so, you think about workforce development and how can we inspire young folks to not only go into STEM careers, but specifically space, is this Journey to Mars. I'll just give you a one-of example I had last week. A lady called me, and she said, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid, and I wanted to work in the space program. But then when I got into college, I thought, well, that was just because I was a kid. That's really not something that I could do, or that, I really have a goal or an inspiration or whatever. And so she has a 4.0 at chemical engineering, and she's going to graduate next year. And she called me, and she's in the natural gas industry. She's been interning with the natural gas industry. She called me because she said, I went to an AIAA conference, and they were talking about going to Mars. And they were talking about what kind of people we need, what kind of fields we need, what kind of, technology we need. And there's so many different things that I would love to do that. And so I want to talk to you about, the future and future astronauts that are needed, et cetera. So that's just one example of the workforce development. Also, we've got to bring the younger folks in the pipeline, and hopefully we can mentor them, and hopefully, they'll be the ones that'll be taking us to Mars. So we really need to inspire them and educate them and get them ready for that.
Can I also add on to that? And I think those three things are important, but I think I'd also add on engage them in a way to make them feel as if they're contributing to that from the get-go, not just, hey, this is kind of going to come up in 2030. Right. You'll probably be a program manager maybe, or you'll be on the crew side or whatnot. Instead of just telling them that, being able to show them and get their input in how to shape all of that, I think is really crucial as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. This is a lot. This is a very rich conversation. One of the things so I was on the Human Spaceflight Committee for the National Academies, NRC, a few years ago, and we were tasked with looking across all the civil space enterprise, essentially. And we published a report called Pathways to Exploration, which has been pretty controversial. one of the things that became pretty clear in the process of sitting on that committee and working through that was, and I know it sounds trite, but it's true, how hard Mars is relative to the moon. You know, we have in our history, it's become almost iconic, this sense that we picked up and went to the moon, and now we see this beautiful red globe sort of calling us. But I saw a great analogy the other day, a comparison, where they said that if you were moving at light speed, it would take 1.6 seconds to get to the moon, and it would take 48 minutes to get to Mars. So if you do the math, okay, you start to realize just how different these distances are, and how difficult the logistics, which is really, it's a logistics problem. Okay, how difficult the logistics are. So one of the things that was really impressed upon me when I came out of that committee was that it was going to take everything we have, meaning we as a species, okay, we as human beings. It was going to take a lot of resources and thought and cooperation and competition. By the way, I think both those things are important, okay, and international contributions and civil programs and commercial programs and, okay, and just a whole lot to do this. And so I began to think about whether or not this journey to Mars, or this process of moving human beings off the planet to learn to live in space, to become a spacefaring species, whether or not it can be used as an organizing principle, truly. Can you talk about it as a global enterprise? I mean, are we at the point where, especially with all the stresses and strains in the world, you know, can the United States, people in the United States and their allies, can we talk about this process of moving off the planet and moving toward Mars? Can we really talk about it as an organizing principle? Is it a way that we can pattern our education about it? Can we literally build foreign policy with some space? We did it before, right? Can we build foreign policy with space? Can we think about economic development, which is already happening, by the way, in the private sector, okay, certainly starting in the United States, but beginning to spread, okay, where venture capital is starting to come in because space is kind of becoming an organizing principle, developing that way in the market. Can it be an organizing principle? I mean, can we build curriculum around it? Can we build foreign policy around it? Can we pattern economic development programs on it? Can we, I mean, if you think about it that way, that sort of gets to what you're talking about, Maddie, when you think about bigger, right? Don't just think about the journey itself, but can we do something like that? Are there examples of that anywhere?
I think we can. I don't know if we're collectively there yet, but not just in space. I think this is true for any industry. It almost seems like, to me, you kind of have to start at the top and work your way down. And a lot of times, I think all of us in various industries, we go the other direction, which is why it kind of gets tough to think past what things like spinoffs, because you get clouded in kind of appreciating what your industry is capable of doing and trying to find the ties going that way versus kind of looking at the top needs or issues that you want to try to solve and kind of work back down. The example I would use is in the commercial industry, especially with economic development. The internship I did between my 2 years of grad school was with the state of Texas. I worked in their workforce development office under the governor's office, and my task was to come up with an economic development strategy for commercial space in the state of Texas. And that basically just required looking at across the board what's going on in the state in the commercial industry, or commercial space industry, and then trying to see what goals the state of Texas had by way of workforce development, economic development in municipalities and localities, and tax incentives, things like that, looking at what those goals were and how those things that were happening, those activities that were happening across the state could align with policies. And so we were looking at some of the tax incentive policies that were coming through in bills and looking at whether there were conversations around incentive programs and whether they should continue or not. And so it was looking kind of broadly at what the needs were across the state and then being able to align, looking to see what the commercial space activities were and how those things aligned. So I think if we took that kind of a piecemeal approach maybe, because I think if you look at it too broadly, it can get overwhelming. But I think if you look at it piecemealed like that and take kind of almost a systems engineering approach to looking at how those needs and activities align across the board, civil, commercial, military, domestically, abroad, you'd be able to get to that point where space could be an organizing principle, and you could see it in education as an organizing principle. And it's not going to all happen at once, so you're going to have to look at it in the priorities that matter to the nation. But I think there's definitely nothing stopping us from using Journey to Mars, especially since we're kind of still relatively at the beginning of it, to evolve it in a way that it kind of weaves into the fabric of things that the nation needs, and therefore budget doesn't become a problem, or it's not going to become as much of a problem, and things like that.
Well, I definitely think it could be an organizing thing for the world, but we should lead it. And so I really hope that, things like this conference help people realize that it could be an international project, and we should lead it. And there's plenty of work and plenty of challenges that need to be done. And I think one of the things that astronauts have in common is that when we look back at the Earth, we're not from Alabama or the United States. We're from planet Earth. And so realistically, if we look at it that way, if we have the other countries and people who would participate in this program to go to Mars would look at it that way, it would be an organizing thing, and it would be a way that would go there, from planet Earth and not just from our country or that country. So it can organize a lot of things.
Okay, and it seems to me if it could organize a lot of things, then what you were sort of saying earlier about funding, right? Inflow of money, but outflow of money too. If we weren't just talking about it in the stovepipe of space. I just want to pick up a little bit on the economic development piece. I spent a lot of time living in that world for various reasons. Just to point out that there are these pieces of things lying around right now, right, where there's the sort of return, I won't say new, because it's actually happened 2 times before that I've been involved, but certainly new in character. New in nature, flow of venture capital, right, into space startups and space companies. That's on the one hand. Then there's this notion of trying to develop a commercial space sector or marketplace. I don't want to say market because I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but value chain of economic activity in low Earth orbit. A lot of thinking about, I actually wrote a paper about 2 years ago called LEO is an economic development region, trying to get in the rules right, so that you don't trample on that economic development. And then there's talk now. After the reception tonight, Rick Tomlinson's going to be on, and Rick's a buddy of mine. Are you out there?
Thought I saw
him. Anyway, yay, hi. Who's founded Deep Space Industries, and there's also Planetary Resources, and these are folks that are trying to develop ways to actually access resources in space for economic gain, and sort of also to return to the nation. So there are these pieces laying around that have gotten some venture capital in, but there's also value in the long-term programs that are associated with civil space. NASA just published 2 reports, 3, I think, actually. There was one for SLS, one for Orion, and one for ground systems. And they published them a few weeks ago, or maybe before that, we became aware of them a few weeks ago. And they were talking about the impact to small businesses. And the impact to small businesses in those programs, by the time they're done, is going to exceed $3 or $4 billion. It's a lot of money in the small business pipeline. And the reason that's important in the United States is 97% of new job starts are in small businesses. I don't know if you knew that or not. 97%. The vast majority of patents come out of small businesses. The vast majority of innovation and technological advances doesn't come from the big labs. It used to, okay? But now it's far more distributed, and it tends to come from small businesses and standalone institutions, okay? And the way that these things are all working together. The long lead time aspect of these programs, sort of insurance that you get in a civil space program, allows sort of a baseline for those small businesses to proceed. And it's also been an organizing principle for some of those. I'm going to call out a company I'm familiar with. called Futuramic, which is in Michigan. And Futuramic was doing machining for the auto industry, right? And when Detroit went down and the auto industry went down, it took a whole lot of business with it. I mean, it took Detroit with it, okay? But it took a whole lot of business with it. And Futuramic was on the edge. And they retooled, and they went after aviation contracts first, then aerospace contracts. And their contractor on SLS, I think they're also a contractor on Orion, I'm not certain. And they are now actively hiring and giving back to their community and sort of doing a whole lot of things. So these are sort of, again, stovepipes kinds of ways that the journey to Mars and the sort of increased interest in getting off the planet and finding different ways to utilize space and take advantage of all this ingenuity and capability and international cooperation and venture capital and all the rest of it to sort of create economics. So I think, in a way, it may be starting to happen economically, acting as an organizing principle just because of the way that markets work, right? And that capital works. But maybe we need to look to that and sort of think about how we could use it more broadly. So, okay. We've been yakking for a while now, and we know that we're between you and the reception, and I think Scott's going to come on after us. I just want to give you a couple of minutes if you had any questions for us or comments for us, and I hope the conversation's been halfway interesting anyway.
Someone's right there.
Yeah.
My name's Lee Irons. I'm a father of 5 kids, all interested in various aspects of helping our country with various things. One of those is, of course, traveling to Mars. And I love that you guys are talking about how we get the younger generation involved and start doing this. I see lots of kids putting a lot of energy into their college education, and they're starting younger and younger in terms of doing internships and independent study and starting their own research, lifelong research interests as early as sophomore year in college. So how do we do what you're saying, connect those dots from here's a person, here's a young woman interested in STEM who's doing her own Mars research, and how do you get her noticed? How do you get people to come in and sponsor that? How do you connect the dots from her college career to her actually having an impact on a Mars mission? And then how do you democratize that across 1 million of kids like that?
You want to take it?
Well, that's a great question because we, especially for women, don't do that very well right now. In fact, AAEW put out a report called Why So Few? And it's why are there so few women or young people going to these fields? So it takes parents, it takes teachers, it takes educating the teachers as well as the student, but also providing programs like Madi was talking about that she was involved with, and in an integrated fashion, you know, in a way that is consistent and that follows through so that we can not only get that person interested in the STEM, they go into college in STEM, they stay in it in college because the dropout rate is higher for those fields than for other fields. And then once they graduate, you know, we have the workforce development and we get them in those jobs and keep them in those jobs. So it's a challenge, you know, through that whole string of events in a young person's life. And so I hope that we can inspire them and keep them using this mission to Mars and in an integrated way so that they do get noticed and they do contribute to that.
There's one there and then one over there.
Yeah.
Oh, another one there.
You know, Mike?
Your mic.
Is there a mic? I don't know what there's.
While we're waiting, I just want to mention when I went to the Association of Space Explorers conference in China 2 years ago, there's a lady astronaut who is a teacher, and she went on their space station and had a curriculum of courses for everyone in the country at all levels who did these experiments on the ground. And then when she went in space, she did those experiments in space. And so they compared, you know, how they did them on the ground with how they did them in space. So that's just an example of an integrated program at all levels to keep the interest high. And Mission to Mars is an excellent way to do that. And we can use the proving ground of International Space Station to even start that process.
So it doesn't look like there's a mic. Can you come closer to the stage or just speak up? Or?
Oh, no, she has
I've got
got a
it.
mic.
Oh, you got the mic. Cool.
Yeah, I got
Sorry.
it. No problem. So just Chelsea Cook from Virginia, just kind of as a follow-up to the last comment, I'm more of a comment than a question, but I really think, I know NASA is great at doing this. I know that the government in general is great at doing this, but what the astronaut presenter said a few minutes ago about we're all human. When we look back at the Earth, we're not from a certain country, the borders disappear, and we're all going to Mars. I really think that that needs to be taken to a psychological and a human level. As a woman, as a person with a STEM degree who also happens to have a disability and who doesn't care, I want to go to Mars. I think that really needs to be taken into consideration. I'll be around if you want to connect with me offline. I have connections to that community, and I think that's super, super critical to start them early and super, super important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, sorry.
There were 2 questions.
Sure.
Given my accent, I'm not a US citizen, but I will build off the comment that was just made then. We've heard a lot about international collaboration, we've heard a lot about these emerging space nations that are popping up with all these trained people. I suppose my question is, how can the US change its policy so that these emerging space nations can contribute to NASA's journey to Mars, while ITAR produces such a barrier to it?
Okay, I'm going to take a part of that. And then with regard to ITAR, well, let me take ITAR first. So there's been work on ITAR. As you know, there was just a revision of ITAR. And ITAR is better than it was prior to the revision. It's the national, for all you know, it means basically the international trafficking and arms regulations, right? Where there are technologies that have dual use. It's particularly important or particularly relevant to aerospace because in aerospace there's a lot of, quote, dual use technology, which means simply technology that's developed either for civil space or for the military and which has use in the other realm. And so with regard to the United States, ITAR is a series of regulations. If you are sort of venturing into that area of dual use, you have to undergo review before you can do export, okay, or collaborate with international partners because of the concern of transferring that technology out that may have security implications for the United States. That's it in a nutshell. So the regulations have been recently reviewed and changed, and they're a little bit better, but we're probably going to need another iteration, and I think people are aware of that. It took quite a campaign to get the last iteration done, but the previous set of ITAR regulations had economic impacts to the United States, including to the launch industry, satellite industry, et cetera, which is funny because they were originally, especially satellite, okay, intended to sort of protect, right, that technology. So I think that's going to have to continue to be reviewed. Now, in addition to that, though, business-to-business relationships, okay, they'll sort of find a way, all right? So that's one of the things that's happening. The other thing that's happening is, and I just want to point back to the space station, when I worked on station, there were 16 countries involved, and then there were 18 countries involved, and then there were 20 countries involved. And now there are over 90 countries that have flown or in some way participated in the space station. The space station is a marvel. The space station is the greatest peacetime construction project in history for a big piece. It is incredible because it continues to facilitate international cooperation, even at times that the individual nations aren't necessarily getting along so good. But it also has had this effect of bringing in nations who really want to participate to create a space program inside their own nation with the idea of getting the ball rolling. So Malaysia comes to mind. Okay, they want to develop a space program. So the way they did it was to basically open up astronaut applications. They got 12,000 astronaut applications first time they did it. Okay, and they ended up flying an astronaut. I have an astronaut flying on the International Space Station. So there are mechanisms. I think there's going to be more of that, not necessarily station, but if there's follow-on stations or platforms, okay, in LEO. Low Earth orbit, okay, and then also more opportunity for international collaboration over time as we move toward Mars. We're going to have that, okay, sort of move toward Mars. But understanding that there's always going to be regulations and treaty issues, and how do you do business with this group, and how do you do, and that's just the nature of, I think, the sort of cross-national collaboration. But agree with you that that stuff will continue to need review. Other questions? Okay, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and thank my guests here for participating with me. So, appreciate it.